Lost in Details describes me quite well, be it Tolkien's lore and Lord of the Rings or other things I have passion for. One of those passions is the original Final Fantasy VII from 1997. With Deus Ex from 2000, it's my favorite game of all time. It may sound exaggerated, but these two games had a huge impact on me personally as a teenager back in the day and are part of the explanation for me why I'm often obsessed with looking deeper into topics, finding all the details and trying to connect everything. Now, over 20 years later, I make YouTube videos that do exactly this, mainly about Tolkien's universe. But today I'll return to my roots. The Final Fantasy VII Remake releases 23 years after Final Fantasy VII, and I think that's a good time to look back into the original. See this as a lore video about the original Final Fantasy VII, where we focus on a creature from the game called Jenova and all that is connected to it. We go back into the year 1997 and ignore all the weird things Square did to the game's story afterwards. Interestingly, another title I could have given this video would be Lost and Created in Translation, but we come to this later. So, disclaimer, I will ignore everything that is not in the original English version of Final Fantasy VII from 1997. I also try to explain every detail, but of course it would help if you have played Final Fantasy VII before. I don't speak Japanese and we will mainly look at what you got when you bought this game back in the day outside of Japan and the West, be it Europe or the US. Also, of course, massive spoiler warning for Final Fantasy VII. I won't talk about the remake, but of course both games are connected. Also a little hint from the future. For reasons I always pronounced it Cetra in my youth. There was no voiceover back in the day, and I never learned that it's pronounced Cetra until I released this video in April 2020. In the Japanese version it seems to be Setora, and now I know it better, but for this re-release of this video I did not re-record the script again, sorry. So in the video I always say Cetra, but I know it's pronounced Cetra by now. When I played through Final Fantasy VII the first time, I was blown away, but still had so many questions. The first thing I did after playing through the game was starting a second playthrough immediately, trying to find answers. Was Cloud now a Sephiroth clone or not? What does this mean anyway, and what did just happen at the end? I can tell you it wasn't my last playthrough. My young teenage self had never experienced something like this after completing a video game. The story was complex and you had to use your brain to fully understand it. It also had some parts that required you as player to actually find your own interpretation. Maybe as a small explanation, many JRPG classics like Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger did not release in my country on Super Nintendo, so I had not played them yet, and this story complexity was new to me. But back to Final Fantasy VII. Talking to my friends in school who also had played through it, I noticed that we understood many details very differently. Ask 10 people and get 10 different interpretations. That was also something I had never experienced before when it just came to understanding a story of a game. A relatively new upcoming technology, at least for consumers, called the internet, would help me understanding this a bit more. There I stumbled upon a long text written by a guy called John Brittenham, which was translated into German by some guys in a forum. It had an interpretation in one of its parts that resonated really well with me, even though the rest felt far-fetched. I was quite confused about who I was actually following half of the game. Was it Genova or Sephiroth? But if it was actually Genova who is active the whole time and Sephiroth is just this legless half-dead guy in this weird bubble at North Crater, what is his role in all of this? But he's the main villain, isn't he? I fight him at the end, right? Brittenham's interpretation included the idea, among many others, that Sephiroth is not the main antagonist of the game. It was actually Genova who is the puppet master behind all of this. Quote, "You are just a puppet." The theme of the puppet that is controlled is often mentioned throughout the game. This resonated well with what I thought so far, and I felt that there was also much evidence for this in the game. He continued with weird number symbolism, which is the mentioned far-fetched part of his interpretation. I never agreed with him on that, but the idea of Genova manipulating everyone, playing out the factions against each other, and trying to destroy the planet to fuse with all its life energy in the end to empower itself even further to a godlike entity seemed extremely plausible to me. I began to look further into this and try to find evidence for what I will call the Jenova Theory in this video. The opposite approach where Sephiroth is the puppet master and even Genova is under his control, I will call Sephiroth Theory. After some playthroughs and doing some more research, I came to the conclusion that this theory was highly plausible. Another option would be a Sephiroth-Genova fusion theory, which would unite the Sephiroth and Genova theory. I would say that this one is also very plausible. However, both theories on their own had good arguments, and among the fans and, for example, forums who wrote a lot about this and discussed it in detail, the supporters for each theory were pretty evenly distributed, at least from my perspective. As a disclaimer, I was of course a supporter of the Genova theory, but I learned fast that the makers of Final Fantasy VII were either fools or geniuses. Now, after over 20 years, I played again on my little Twitch stream through Final Fantasy VII in the unmodified Steam version in English as an adult, still a fool but maybe a bit smarter and experienced than my teenage self. And I looked if the Genova theory would still be a plausible theory from my today's perspective, only looking at the original game. And spoiler, yes, it is. But let's understand why. First, we need to understand a few things. What is Genova? This is actually a hard to answer question, and from my perspective, the game does not give us too much information about the true Genova. Most of this comes from observations throughout the game and Ifalna, which is Aerith's mother, and the last pure-blooded Cetra. Cetra, or ancients, were probably the ancestors of the humans, who lived in harmony with nature and the planet, and had the ability to communicate with the planet called Gaia, which is actually something like a living entity. So as Cetra, Ifalna could communicate with the planet itself, who was a witness of when Genova landed on Earth. Considering this, Ifalna seems like a trustworthy source. Her intention is to preserve the knowledge of the Cetra, and why would she lie to her husband, Professor Gust? Beyond that, she is the player's only source on the lore of old. Quote, "It, the planet, said something fell from the sky, making a large wound. This clearly indicated that Genova came from outside the planet. It's an alien from outer space. It fell from the sky on the planet, wounding it and creating a giant crater 2000 years later, known as the Norse crater." But Ifalna said more. It, Genova, looked like our dead mothers and our dead brothers, showing us specters of their past. That's when the one who injured the planet, or the crisis from the sky as we call it, came. It first appeared as a friend, deceived them and finally gave them the virus. The Cetra were attacked by the virus and went mad, transforming into monsters. Then, just as it had at the North Pole, it approached other Cetra clans, infected them with the virus. Genova, the crisis from the sky, seems to have spread a virus. How correct the term virus is used here, we don't know. For example, the term clone seems to be used a bit wider in the game. We come to that later. Also, in the interview about weapons, Ifalna definitely confirms that the crisis from the sky is Genova. This virus drove people mad and transformed them into monsters. This sounds familiar to what we observe in the game, for example with the so-called Sephiroth clones. The poor people mad Shinra scientist Hojo experimented on, dressed in black robes with a number tattooed on them, or the monsters in the Nibelheim reactor. Genova is also described as being deceptive, taking the forms of others, in this case dead people, and creating visions or maybe illusions of the past. Quote, "showing us specters of their past." We see it in the game multiple times. In the Whirlwind Maze section at the North Crater, our group is pulled into a vision of Cloud's past. So what Ifalna says is also what we actually see in the game, which means what she described must be true, at least when it comes to Jenova's abilities. In the vision created by Genova of Cloud's true past at the Whirlwind Maze, we also get confirmation of this again. Here Genova's in disguise says, "The ability to change one's looks, voice and words is the power of Genova." What is interesting though, this ability is independent from Genova's cells, or the virus as Ifalna called it. At least that's my interpretation of the virus. Even members that do 100% not have Genova's cells in them are pulled into the illusion. It also seems easy for Genova to take the shapes of others and switch between them, no matter what gender or creature. We can witness it in the Whirlwind Maze section. In the Ifalna video logs, the virus is mentioned after the line about Genova appearing as dead and showing them visions of the past, so there was no connection implied. This is again coherent with what we experienced during the game's plot. The virus seems first of all related to people going mad and transforming them into monsters. There is another observation we can make. Besides Genova-related events, only the live stream, so the massive life force inside the planet as being itself, seems to have the ability to create visions. Ares also can communicate with Cloud in his dream, so the ability to create illusions seems not common in the world of Final Fantasy VII, which implies Genova was definitely already very powerful when she arrived. And even the Cetra seemed to be powerful, but Genova still was a massive threat to them. After Genova confronted those people in the North continent region called Noel's Pole, she continued to attack the other Cetra clans and infected them with the virus, I assume her cells. In the video logs about the weapons, Ifalna also explains that the planet could not fully heal from the crater Genova caused with her landing, described as wound of the planet, as long as Genova existed, so the planet monitored the extraterrestrial entity closely. I interpret this as the planet recognizing Genova as a massive threat, and that maybe there was more to the North Crater than it just being a hole in the planet's surface. It seems Genova's pure existence was preventing this wound from being closed. This shows that Genova was not just some strong alien thing with a virus killing people and showing some illusions, but more like a demigod that attacked the planet as a being on a whole different level. Then a small number of surviving powerful Cetra, maybe a party like our heroes from the game's main story, defeated Genova and confined it. What is important here, they were not able to kill or destroy her and could only confine her in some way. The planet created the so-called weapons to protect itself from Genova too, but when Genova was confined, these powerful creatures were no longer needed and put asleep by the planet because Genova was still not dead and could come back, as explained in the video logs. This shows how big a threat she was, with the amount of knowledge the Cetra had, and that they were able to confine Genova also shows that they must have been quite powerful beings too. If we see the strength of the weapons, the planet for sure evaluated a tough battle with Genova, which is also an implication for Genova's might and danger. Note, Ruby and Emerald weapon were not in the original Japanese version of the game and added as optional super bosses for the Western release. I think you also don't fight Diamond weapon, who just appears in the cutscenes in the Japanese version. Still, from the perspective of the Western version, these are the most powerful enemies in the game, and the planet saw them as necessary to defeat Genova. However, according to Sephiroth, over the next millennia, parts of the Cetra slowly developed into the humans of the planet on which Final Fantasy VII takes place, retrospectively called Gaia, settling down and starting to live a very different life compared to that of the traditional and nomad-like Cetra, losing the ability to hear and communicate with the planet. 2,000 years later, Professor Gust, the leading scientist of the Shinra Electric Company, found a dead body in a 2,000-year-old geological stratum. At least he thought it was dead. I assume he found it during an excavation. This information is cited by Sephiroth out of a document during the flashback section in Calm, where Cloud explains what he thinks is his backstory. You could argue that Cloud at this point had not yet restored his memories, but Cloud's memories are just mixed with Zack's. The information in them is not wrong. We could have reread the document ourselves, but the game does not have this option. That's why I think the information given there must be right. Professor Gust called this being Genova, which contains the Jewish name for God, and I assume Nova, which is Latin and means new. Nova is grammatically feminine. The professor also thought the dead body was that of an ancient Cetra from 2,000 years ago. The Shinra somehow heard about a place called the Promised Land in ancient Cetra lore. They wanted to find it because as electric company that uses Marco energy, that is the liquid form of the life energy or life stream of the planet, of which every being becomes part again when it dies. To produce power, they thought this place, if it existed, would offer an immeasurable amount of Marco energy, and so their plan was to create their own Cetra out of Genova cells, who was under their control and I assume loyal to them, who would lead them to the Promised Land to build Neo Midgar there. That was the idea behind the Genova Project. The secret laboratories were in the Shinra Manor in Nibelheim and in the Nibelheim reactor where Genova was stored. What they at some point did to produce a Cetra was taking the unborn human child of Professor Hojo and his assistant and lover Lucretia and injected Genova cells into the child in the womb of its mother, as Hojo explains this horrible experiment himself. And this child was of course Sephiroth, and Shinra thought he would be a Cetra hybrid. Sephiroth is again a word from Jewish mysticism. However, the assumption that Genova was an ancient was wrong. And how could they know better? They knew there were Cetra once on the planet and found someone from that time that looked weird but somehow still human-like. The idea of it being an alien from outer space was not obvious at all, so of course they would think it was a Cetra. Professor Gust learned the truth much later from Ifalna, the last living pure-blooded Cetra, after he left Shinra. I assume it's never really explained in the original game. As a byproduct of the Genova Project, they also tried what would happen if you inject selected humans' Genova cells in combination with Marco energy. This probably created soldiers, Shinra's elite soldiers. Other poor souls were put into these chambers so that they would transform into monsters from the Genova cells. I assume that was also Hojo's doing. After Sephiroth vanished and Nibelheim was destroyed, crazy Hojo injected Genova cells to more normal people, likely survivors of the incident, so townspeople of Nibelheim, and probably showered them with Marco energy too, which would destroy their sanity and mind, and they would become the mentioned so-called Sephiroth clones. As we learn from Ifalna, the virus drives people insane. I assume he did this to test his reunion theory, which basically says that at some point every cell of Genova returns to Genova to reunite with the main entity. Why they don't turn into monsters, I don't know though. There seems to be an unknown factor for this we can only speculate about. For example, Hojo seems to be able to activate the transformation when we fight against him on the Sister Ray cannon in Midgar, Shinra's main city. For soldier, only the best are selected who are capable to physically and mentally withstanding the injection of Genova cells and the Marco energy procedure, which grants them superhuman strength and toughness. Genova is hard to kill too, which we learn throughout the game. She just keeps reappearing again and again. A weird case and slight contradiction seems to be Lucretia. She was believed to be dead, but we can find her and she explains that the Genova inside her would not let her die. However, she seems to be immune to the Genova reunion, does not turn into a monster, and she does not go insane, which seems unusual. Hojo is totally different from that. He is present during the reunion, turns into a monster, and is insane. Lucretia seems like a weird special case, and meeting her is also very bizarre and also optional. Maybe she is actually a ghost but does not know. The original game does not explain it, and I think the developers did not think too much about her and integrating her reappearance into the world at the time Final Fantasy VII was made. Sometimes a story needs some mystery, and she is exactly that. Speaking of Hojo, he seems to produce monsters in these tanks in the Nibelheim reactor, which again fits to what Ifana said. We are basically talking about biological weapons. It's quite interesting that, for example, Resident Evil from 1996 and the other entries of the series also went into this direction thematically, even though more grotesque and in a different genre, but questionable secret experiments to create biological weapons and alike in old mansions seems to be a famous theme of that time. However, we clearly see in Final Fantasy VII that people with Genova cells in them, especially those that are not strong enough mentally, can be completely controlled by Genova like a puppet. This is at least true for Cloud and the Sephiroth clones, maybe even for Hojo. There is this weird honeybee inn scene with President Shinra that could imply he was under Genova's influence too, but it's probably just an Easter egg. There's still one little detail we need to understand though. Genova was not dead and seems immortal and almost unkillable. Ifana seems to be right here. She hinted at that Genova was just confined but not dead and could still return at some point. When Genova awoke or had again the strength to act again is not known, but the possibility exists that she awoke fairly early after she was found and played along as dead because she knew that this situation could be exploited. The scientists basically spread her cells for free, creating puppets for her, and let her in addition infiltrate Shinra, the most powerful corporation of the planet that rules over it alone. And nobody knew she was still alive or what she was. This is just my assumption though, but it would give her a motive to not break out. Maybe she also needed some time to regenerate. We don't know. Last time with the Cetra, Genova maybe revealed her intentions too early and was confined before she could kill all Cetra because of that. It would make sense for her to work more subtle this time. Hojo in all this time seems to be completely insane, even though after all he did, he continued and later injected Genova cells into himself. We then see him transforming into a monster. I always had the idea that he was manipulated by Genova too, of course without him noticing it. Sadly, there is not much evidence for that except him being crazy, sacrificing his lover and own child, doing experiments on the poor survivors of the Nibelheim incident, turning humans into monsters. He also shot Vincent, it did not look like self-defense, and experimented on Vincent's body. From my observation, he never really does anything good or helpful, not even to himself. What is his intention? Just science? He actively helps Genova, or as he believes Sephiroth, to win, creating more puppets for them or shooting more energy at them. However, the best argument I have, he is there at the Genova reunion at the North Crater too. You could say he had reasons to be there, but that is true for Cloud too. He later confesses that he injected himself Genova cells, but we don't know when exactly he did it, and he probably lost his usefulness at that point anyway. He was also always close to Genova, so I don't see why he could not have been manipulated or slowly driven insane by her, even far in the past. If we come back to Genova's abilities, we learn that her body can move around without its head. As said, she is hard to kill. Back in the Nibelheim incident, Sephiroth cut off Genova's head and took it with him, while he left the body behind. Sephiroth, of course, fell into the livestream with the head and his sword. The body that was left behind was, however, still not dead. So why would the head be dead then? It's clearly not. The body also seems to have the power to change forms and create illusions too, even without the head, so it remained fully functional in this state. This basically just created another Genova that was remote controlled. For the most part of the game, we believe that we follow Sephiroth, but in truth it was Genova's headless body that took the shape of Sephiroth. While leaving the Shinra HQ, it murdered President Shinra, even though I still don't understand how the thought of Sephiroth could have been left behind in the president's body. I assume it's actually a leftover from an early development stage of the game, and the developers did not put too much thought into it and kept it because it's a very strong scene. Would have made sense seeing it disappear at some point or turning into something like a tentacle because it was just an illusion. Maybe it did later just off camera. If we follow the further story, we also notice that almost every time when we confront Sephiroth, we actually fight Genova instead. Usually a body part of Sephiroth is dropped and then it grows into a new Genova form that we have to fight then, while we often see Sephiroth flying away. It's quite interesting. Headless Genova in her Sephiroth disguise can fly. Interestingly, Cloud can also fly in one scene when he is under Genova's or Sephiroth's control. Sometimes the Sephiroth clones also seem to become active and fulfill orders. For example, Dio, the owner of the gold saucer, tells us about a black hooded guy with the number 1 tattooed on his hand, asking for black materia. The main evidence for Headless Genova in disguise is that the game explains this itself because it can be very hard to get in this complicated story. In the Whirlwind Maze, we find this dialogue between Cloud and Tifa. Quote, Genova's cells. So that's what this is all about, the Genova reunion. Not Sephiroth? You mean all this time it wasn't Sephiroth we've been after? All this, of course, adds to Hojo's reunion theory. It seems all separated parts of Genova will return to the main entity and unite with it at some point, either by going there or by manipulating the host to do so. With this, we have a basic and relatively factual outline of what happened, what Genova is, and what Genova can do. If we ask, does Genova have the tools and abilities needed to be a puppet master in the background, secretly controlling and manipulating people, we can clearly answer this with yes. This, however, still does not make it true. We would need to ask the same about Sephiroth. Could he be the puppet master? The main argument for Sephiroth is what Hojo says, quote, but being a genius that I am, I soon figured it out. You see, it was all Sephiroth's doing. Sephiroth is not just content to diffuse his will into the live stream. He wants to manipulate the clones himself. So Hojo believes it's Sephiroth's doing, but he also admits he just figured it out. It's his claim. Cloud also speaks of Sephiroth and a powerful will. Quote, he's here. The real Sephiroth is just beyond here. It's both incredibly wicked and cruel, but it's releasing a powerful, strong will from deep within this planet's wound. What is interesting in Cloud's statement, it actually fuels the Jenova Theory. Cloud says it's releasing a powerful, strong will. He says it instead of he, and Genova is several times referred to as a thing or it. However, this seems like an obvious translation error. I checked a let's play of the Japanese version to get the Japanese text and asked a native speaker for help. Shoutouts to Hawkeye777. Link to his Twitch channel and Twitter is in the description. And the sentence is basically translated correctly when it comes to meaning. However, gender does not exist in Japanese, and it probably is connected to an earlier sentence where Sephiroth is mentioned. I also checked a fan translation, but there they added whole sentences that were not in the Japanese version at all, so not useful at all for my purpose here. Looking into some bits of the English translation and comparing it to the Japanese version with my very limited possibilities, I don't speak Japanese, they simply translated text box after text box into English. I assume at times some translations were just phrased poorly or ignored the last few text boxes, which could make it unclear what gender or person they were referring to, leading to some mistakes like this one. But you can clearly see how this little mistake probably fueled a lot of speculation. The Genova Theory was considered a very solid theory for years back in the day. Interesting little side note, Google Translate translates the Japanese sentence for some reason with she instead of it or he, which I think is a quite funny coincidence too. Of course, from the story's perspective, it must be questioned how Cloud knows this. He is manipulated throughout the game a lot and has not fully seen through his own past at this point in the game. Of course, he has a connection to the antagonists through the Genova cells in him, and he is drawn to them and thus maybe feels their presence, but he is also used by the antagonists who try to make him insecure about his own identity and personality. I think Cloud just has a strong theory of his own here, combined with what he maybe senses. Same with Hojo when he says, "But being a genius that I am, I soon figured it out. You see, it was all Sephiroth's doing." The idea behind a puppet master in the background is that you don't see him, and I would argue one part of the Jenova Theory was that it's hidden and not obvious, like a conspiracy, and that the game wants to trick the player, making it look like it was Sephiroth doing all the time, so nobody pays attention to what Genova does, which makes it difficult for her enemies to fight and predict what's happening next, not realizing how they are played out against each other the whole time. And Genova is very successful with this. She gets the black materia, the weapons attack the humans and not her. Shinra and our heroes are also busy fighting each other and chasing a fake Sephiroth. If you look at this, you see a Mastermind in the background. Of course, it would also work with Sephiroth as Mastermind, but I always saw this as less elegant, because everyone talks about Sephiroth the whole time, but Genova is rarely mentioned. So back to Sephiroth's abilities. The idea is that his powerful will even brought Genova under his control, and that he got all her abilities and the knowledge of the Cetra in the livestream. With this, he could be the puppet master too. For me, some questions remain though. Are there implications for this? How can he overpower Genova to the point of controlling her? How can he infuse his will into the livestream of the planet? And here we find little evidence. There are interpretations that Genova, after Professor Gust found her, is so damaged, I assume, that she is mindless and can't act anymore by herself. And in the glass tank, she looks pretty dead, except for her smiling when Sephiroth frees her. But of course, throughout the game, we have several encounters with her, and she again does what Ifana described, for example, changing her form. In my opinion, it could also be that Sephiroth is mindless after he fell into the livestream. Genova seems to be able to handle the livestream's power because of how well her cells react to Mako energy, which is essentially the livestream in fluid form. If an organism with Genova cells injected can handle Mako energy better without getting, for example, Mako poisoning so easily, it makes sense to assume a whole organism out of Genova cells, so the original being is even more capable, maybe even able to live inside the livestream. But this is nothing humans with physical bodies do, and Sephiroth, even though a hybrid, was still human, so if he has to live inside the livestream for a longer time, why would he not be affected at all? Not only that, why would he become more powerful instead? We only see the real Sephiroth one time in the game. Here he has no legs and he's not moving, trapped inside this fluid bubble. When he receives the black materia, he does not move, smile or react in any form. His bubble just falls down and vanishes deep inside the planet. I don't see why that could not be a mindless puppet of Genova. Of course, I personally still don't think he is mindless here, but he could be controlled by Genova or even work with her willingly and focus on summoning Meteor because we know he is exceptionally strong and inside the North crater there is enough energy to summon Meteor with the black materia. Ares explains this, quote, "Nope, we can't use it right now. You need great spiritual power to use it. You mean lots of spiritual energy? That's right, one person's power alone won't do it. Somewhere special, where there's plenty of the planet's energy. Oh yeah, the promised land." Even though Sephiroth was exceptionally strong, mind control was not on his ability list so far. We never see him doing something like this in the game. During the incident in Nibelheim and in the reactor, we don't see him mind controlling anyone. When he finds out who he truly is, he becomes insane and seems to be drawn by Genova, calling her mother, promising to free her and taking back the planet. Even thinks that he's a Cetra at the beginning. However, if we meet Sephiroth, or what we think is Sephiroth later in the rebuilt Nibelheim down in the Shinra Manor, Sephiroth says something interesting again. Genova will be at the reunion. Genova will join the reunion, becoming a calamity from the skies. Of course, this is most likely not Sephiroth, but he hints at Genova and becoming the calamity from the skies again. It makes sense from multiple angles. Of course, the fake Sephiroth wants to sell that he is the real Sephiroth, and Cloud continues to follow him. Cloud hates Sephiroth and has a stronger motive of following him than when Sephiroth would have indirectly revealed that he's actually Genova in disguise. Still, it could be simply the truth, which would hint again at the Jenova Theory. Cloud's response is also weird. Genova, a calamity from the skies? You mean she wasn't an ancient? How does Cloud come to this conclusion so quick? It's like 200 IQ. She is from the skies, so can't be an ancient if that's true. Considering how little we know, that seems a strong conclusion, but calamity from the skies can mean anything, and we haven't found Ifalna's interviews yet where the term the crisis from the sky is actually used and partially explained. Nor were we at the Temple of the Ancients yet, at least when you trigger the event in Nibelheim's manor as early as possible. After the temple section, Aerith explains, Sephiroth is different, he's not an ancient. This, by the way, implies that Aerith knows by now that Genova was not an ancient. I think Cloud's response is only there to give us a little bit of exposition. Genova could not be an ancient. Sephiroth's answer to Cloud in the manor is also very weird. I see. I don't think you have the right to participate in the reunion. I will go north past Mount Nibel. If you wish to find out, then follow. I found another entry about strength of will in the ancient temple section. There Aerith talks to someone, I assume the spirits of the ancients. They could become one with the planet, reminds me a bit of Star Wars, but they prevent it with the strength of will. However, those were special ancients that could even form a spirit body, and it's about them not becoming one with the planet. Cloud mentions Sephiroth's will another time, and that's it. I'm not sure if that's enough to control a deceptive alien illusion master that almost wiped out the Cetra alone. In my opinion, the game does not give us an explanation where this powerful will is coming from and why it was not enough to keep Sephiroth's sanity. He murdered a whole town when he found out what he really was and followed very quickly what seemed to be Genova's plan. He threw away his humanity, killed everyone, preached about him taking back the planet that was stolen from his mother, freed Genova, and then at some point created the plan to become a god by fusing with most of the planet's life energy. That fits Genova, but Sephiroth's intention seems not really strong here. Why not just go after Shinra? Why going so far? And what motive gives him the needed strength? In my opinion, there are not enough answers for this. However, there are more interesting dialogues that can be interpreted in different ways. After Aerith left the party to go to the ancient city, she appears in Cloud's dreams. Another indicator that Cetra have some powers humans do not have when she can communicate with Cloud in his dream. I would say the last scene of this dream sequence can be interpreted in several ways. She's thinking of interfering. She will be a difficult one, don't you think? We must stop that girl soon. This could be a short dialogue between Genova and Sephiroth, which would hint at the hybrid theory, or just between the different parts of Genova. Even though I think it's most likely between Genova and Cloud, with Genova being the Genova cells in him disguised as Sephiroth. And it's very interesting in this aspect that the player doesn't know yet that this makes sense. He knows less than the characters at this point. Whoever it is, Genova knows that Ares is dangerous because of the so-called holy spell, which in my opinion only Genova can actually know about. It's a secret materia of the Cetra and the counterspell to Meteor, which in contrast is the ultimate destructive spell that the antagonists cast to wound the planet massively and fuse with the life energy that the planet will set free to heal himself at the place of impact. By doing this, they become a godlike entity. She knows because Genova had, according to Ifalna, access to the memories of the dead Cetra, so she could have definitely known about it. However, Sephiroth can't possibly know it if Genova did not tell him, and I think Genova is needed to actually understand the danger of this counterspell. Killing Ares was also Genova's or Sephiroth's biggest mistake, but we come to that later. If we come back to the initial question, can Sephiroth be the puppet master? The answer is still yes, but he needs to somehow inherit all of Genova's abilities and knowledge, or take full control of her and get access to her memories. Beyond a claim, his willpower is an unknown factor. The game does not give us any examples that he could control an extremely powerful being like Genova, or explain where his sudden boost in willpower came from. We don't even know if willpower is actually enough to do all of that. In the scene where he stabs the 16-year-old Cloud in the Nibelheim reactor, who was too weak for Soldier and had no Genova cells and no Marco energy in him yet, he loses to Cloud and is thrown down into the Marco pit by him. Of course, Sephiroth was injured too, again by Cloud, but this scene does not indicate immense willpower to control Genova, the livestream and multiple Sephiroth clones all at once, generating illusions and being the ultimate puppet master, and that day and night. That of course does not mean he was weak either, but to do what he does in the game, he needs to be a demigod, and being defeated, injured, probably losing his legs and going through the livestream is something where I would expect him to die or be weakened, not suddenly become significantly more powerful. This is, however, different for Genova. She created the North crater by crashing on the planet and survived, and was still powerful. She demonstrated how hard to kill she is, and the planet created these powerful weapons to stop her, and in the end she still survived and is still going strong, even without a head. I see much more plausibility here, and can see Genova's head forming a new body inside the North crater and controlling everything from there. In my opinion, Sephiroth's motive is not that strong. Final Fantasy has many complex characters, and Sephiroth is for sure one of them, but I don't really understand his intentions and motivations because we know so little about him and what he thinks. He has superhuman strengths and could of course have or get immense willpower by finding out how he was created, but he could also break under this knowledge, traveling heavily injured through the livestream with Genova's head, which actually kills normal people, could have destroyed him. I can't imagine that, for example, Soldier's first class can just swim through the livestream and shake it off like it's nothing. They for sure can endure livestream and Marco exposure much better, but they are not immune, and Sephiroth is also partially still human in nature. The game does not build too much foundation here from my perspective, which is a reason why both theories were viable for such a long time. This does of course not mean that the Sephiroth theory is wrong, only that the game does not tell us some details. Now that we have defined and discussed the needed abilities to be the mastermind behind all, we can look for further evidence inside the story. Are there now more direct hints in the plot and dialogues of Final Fantasy VII? Yes, there are two quotes. The second one is very important for the Jenova Theory. First, when we follow Jenova's headless body disguised as Sephiroth, we at some point come to Junon. There we meet her, or as the party believes, Sephiroth on the cargo ship. And Jenova, looking like Sephiroth, asks Cloud an interesting question. Quote, "Who are you?" Jenova does not know who Cloud is, which makes somewhat sense, but if Sephiroth is the puppet master, he should have definitely recognized Cloud. This also indicates that Jenova did not want Cloud to follow her initially. Sephiroth and Cloud have somewhat worked together during their time as Shinra employees, and it was Cloud who defeated Sephiroth and, as mentioned, threw him down the Marco pit in the Nibelheim reactor. Jenova's connection to Cloud, in contrast, is not that strong. Maybe she saw him briefly from the glass tank, or her severed head saw him at some point. So I would argue it makes sense that she does not know who he is at first. Maybe she needs to access Sephiroth's memories to identify him, and she for sure senses his Genova cells in him and sees his value as a tool. The second quote, as mentioned, is a really important one for the Jenova Theory. Cloud explains his past in calm. At the very end of his story, he confronts Sephiroth, this time the real one, who says to him, "I have orders to take this planet back from you stupid people for the Cetra. What am I supposed to be sad about?" He has orders? From who? Of course, from the puppet master, Jenova. This indicates that he is at least not in command. The hybrid theory is, in my opinion, still possible with this though. It's of course not ideal that this quote is from Cloud's mixed up memory, but again, what Cloud remembers is not wrong. He just thinks that he is somebody else. His mind and identity mixed with that of his friend Zack, but Cloud is one of the few people who actually knows what Sephiroth said in the lab in the Nibelheim reactor where Jenova was stored. Of course, the possibility still remains that Sephiroth was under Jenova's control at first and later brought her under his will, but the game does not explain this to us, but it tells us that Sephiroth had orders from a very reliable source, Sephiroth himself, and this time the real one from the past. However, there is another sad truth about this quote. It's also a translation mistake. It should be translated with, "I was born to take this planet back to the Cetra from your foolish people. What should I be sad about?" The question at the end has the connotation of, no, there's nothing to be sad about in Japanese. Again, thank you to Hawkeye777 for his translation and explanation. Of course, here, as mentioned, Sephiroth still assumes he is actually a Cetra, and with this, he assumes Jenova is too. How much would it shock him again to find out that this is also not the case, that he is an alien-human hybrid? Think of this scene again, quote, "Jenova will be at the reunion. Jenova will join the reunion, becoming a calamity from the skies." Jenova, a calamity from the skies? You mean she wasn't an ancient? If Sephiroth is the puppet master, he must know it at that point, so he can tell us there. If he's not the puppet master, it's possible that he does not know it, which makes his story almost tragic. There is this scene just before Jenova in disguise makes Cloud give her the black materia. Quote, "Sephiroth is different. He's not an ancient. He shouldn't be able to find the promised land." "Ah, but I have. I am far superior to the ancients. I became a traveler of the livestream and gained the knowledge and wisdom of the ancients. I also gained the knowledge and wisdom of those after the extinction of the ancients, and soon I will create the future." However, this is again Jenova's headless body in disguise. Only if Sephiroth controls her and what she says, it would again mean that he knows. Jenova could mean herself here. She traveled through the livestream and tries to stay hidden in the background. We again see how just a little translation mistake can cause so much confusion, and it all happened by accident. However, this time the mistake is impossible to identify without checking the Japanese text for comparison. If you just played the English, or in my case the German version back in the day, which has the identical mistake in it because the German translation is based on the English version, you had no idea about it. So to this point the Jenova theory is still alive life and plausible, even without this quote. In my opinion, even more than the Sephiroth Theory, but I'm also a bit biased here. I still have to admit though, the Sephiroth Theory is not that either. Then, in the third last boss fight of the game against Bizarro Sephiroth, we also find a detail that can be interpreted as hinting towards the Jenova Theory. Just a moment before that fight, we again see a Sephiroth with legs flying in front of us, so not the real one. Bizarro Sephiroth then has two heads and no legs. So you could interpret it as a lower part, including the lower head, being the actual Sephiroth, who is now slowly turning into his final form, Safer Sephiroth, the one-ringed angel, now fusing with the remains of Jenova. We defeated her the boss fight before, and there she was called Genova Synthesis. The second head could represent a puppet master Jenova above Sephiroth's head, controlling him and fusing with him for the final form. Of course, this can also be interpreted as hint towards the hybrid theory too, or it's the cocoon that will form Safer Sephiroth's next fight. What speaks a bit against it being Jenova is that the upper head also has a small body that looks masculine and more like Sephiroth. On the other side, Jenova's actual gender or form is also not clear, and she can change it anyway. Quote, "It looked like our dead mothers and our dead brothers." It's not even clear if her female form is her actual form, maybe because Jenova took Sephiroth's shape so often throughout the game that she also took his appearance here as a new standard. Then she maybe fused with Sephiroth's body, becoming a new Jenova that just looks like Sephiroth. Considering that we destroyed Jenova's other parts or bodies completely after the fights, there were also not many fully organisms left, and it could be that she was now mostly present as cells in different people, and especially in Sephiroth. Maybe that's why she needed to fuse with Sephiroth's body at all, who is probably biologically closer to her than all other bodies except her original one. The relationship between Jenova and Sephiroth is, however, not clear at all. She could see him as her son, or maybe sees in him a powerful ally or tool she can use. The last Jenova we fought was called Synthesis, which means to form something new out of multiple components. So each of these three boss fights are a further evolution. First the Synthesis to form something new, then Bizarro Sephiroth is like a cocoon for the final form, Safer Sephiroth. In the final form, Sephiroth also has no legs. He has a wing at his right side that reminds us a bit of Jenova. With this, both evolve together into their new godly form. Who is in control is however hard to answer. Of course, it could also be Sephiroth. Looking into it from my today's perspective, all three theories would work with what we see in the last boss fights. Another aspect we need to look into is Holy. It's called the ultimate white magic that is also able to stop Meteor. As said, it was a mistake to kill Ares so late, because when she was killed she already finished summoning Holy. It was very smart of Ares too. She left the group and did not tell anyone, only in Cloud's dream, which was where Jenova could extract this information from, and then it was too late for Jenova to stop Ares in time. However, the only source on Holy we have is the livestream researcher Bugenhagen. Quote, "Holy, the ultimate white magic, magic that might stand against Meteor, perhaps our last hope to save the planet from Meteor. If a soul seeking Holy reaches the planet, it will appear. Meteor, weapon, everything will disappear, perhaps even ourselves. Even us? It is up to the planet to decide what is best for the planet, what is bad for the planet. All that is bad will disappear, that is all. I wonder which we humans are. Search for Holy? How do we do it? Speak to the planet, get the white materia. This will bond the planet to humans. Then speak to the planet. If our wishes reaches the planet, the white materia will begin to glow a pale green. So if a soul seeking Holy reaches the planet, it will appear and remove everything bad from it, possibly even humanity. This is also what we see at the end of the game, which makes the ending a bit open. It was, in my opinion, ruined by making sequels, because in the original it's not clear what the planet shows. speak to the planet, get the white materia. This will bond the planet to humans. So showing the planet the good intentions of humanity could save them. At the end, we see what Bugenhagen described. However, the game does not resolve the question if humanity is removed or not. A beautiful ending in my opinion. I could also imagine that Aerith's death was at the end even necessary, so her soul could reach the planet to fully unleash Holy and the livestream, removing everything bad and evil. Also, if this white magic is powerful enough to remove even Genova, then Sephiroth or parts of Genova surviving makes no sense as seen in Advent Children or in another installation of the game, which is why I personally dislike Square making sequels. The ability of Holy to remove Genova must exist because without it, Genova will just survive. There are still many people left with their cells in them, like Lucretia, members of Soldier, and maybe Genova has a hidden clone in some dark corner of the world. Sequels to Final Fantasy VII were definitely an afterthought, and if we just look at the original game, it would make no sense otherwise. The planet needs to cleanse itself with all its might. Why this was not done before, I don't know. Maybe Genova prevented it from being summoned in the first place, or Holy was created after Genova was confined, in which case she can't know about it. However, here also lies another ability of Genova or Sephiroth we have not talked about. They were able to trap the spell, either the prayer of Aerith and her summoning of the spell reaching the planet, or the already released spell, or maybe it's even Aerith's soul that needs to reach the planet. It's in my opinion not fully clear. At the end, when we confront Sephiroth and Genova, we see this crystal or maybe biological mass surrounding something glowing. This is where the spell, the summoning or the soul is trapped. So Genova and Sephiroth also must have the ability to stop things, even spells, moving deep inside the planet's livestream, which seems very powerful and is clearly an ability I would attribute to Genova. In addition, we find this quote in the ancient temple section. He shouldn't be able to find the promised land. Ah, but I have. I'm far superior to the ancients. I became a traveler of the livestream and gained the knowledge and wisdom of the ancients. I also gained the knowledge and wisdom of those after the extinction of the ancients, and soon I will create the future. So Genova, Sephiroth, or both, got the knowledge about the livestream as they traveled it. I assume this could have been partially a reason why they were able to trap the spell. Then at the end we see Cloud still sensing Sephiroth or Genova. His spirit leaves his body. It's hard to say if his consciousness is again moved into the livestream like when we restored his mind with Tifa, or if it takes directly place in his own mind. The game makes no indication of it being physical though. It's a spiritual battle against Sephiroth that can't be lost. The tunnels could be the memories stored in the livestream or the nerve pathways and veins of his brain. My favorite interpretation was always that it was a battle in his mind, where he defeats and destroys the last bits of Genova that connects him to her and Sephiroth and frees himself one and for all from their influence. His enemy is represented by the one he hates the most and where all began, Sephiroth. Now Cloud finally settles the score. After it, we see particles similar to a healing spell, which I interpret as him being cleansed, maybe by the livestream through Aerith. We can also see her hand for a short moment. Then cut and it's Tifa's hand. Cloud's body does not seem to have left the spot where he was standing moments ago, and he seems to not have realized that everything started to collapse around him. Conclusion. Officially, Square seemed to go with the Sephiroth Theory. How do we know? In 2005, Square Enix released an official guidebook called Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega, working together with a famous guidebook publisher. It also contains texts, some written by the developers of the game, that explain it was all Sephiroth doing. He is the puppet master. Looking now very deep into the original Western release of Final Fantasy VII, I still come to the conclusion that the Jenova Theory is a highly plausible theory and that sequels make no sense. I would say it is, with the hybrid theory, the most plausible of these three. While officially Genova was maybe even in a mindless state when she was found and Sephiroth became the new master, I don't see why Sephiroth, after he fell into the livestream, could not have been in a mindless state instead. We never see him in action except for flashbacks and maybe at the end, while Genova is active all the time. In the English version, we even have strong evidence for the Jenova Theory. In addition, there is no indicator for a mindless Genova in the game at all, and after the story was released, you can add and claim anything you like anyway. So if it was their intention to go with the Sephiroth as puppet master route, then I must admit that they actually did a poor job explaining this and fleshing out the details surrounding it, or making the most obvious theory, which is Sephiroth is the antagonist, more plausible. Of course, the game builds up Sephiroth as antagonist, but all the inconsistencies make it look like there's more to it, when in reality this was not intended. The Sephiroth theory is of course still possible, but why can Sephiroth do all this? There is no explanation except magic, and he is strong with a powerful will. Wherever he got that from, he was defeated by a 16-year-old Cloud. Why can he even control the mutations of the Genova cells to form his new body? In addition, we have several mistakes in the English translation that by accident indicate the complete opposite. That did not help at all. I think the truth is that Final Fantasy VII's development was, as I guess all game development is, a bit bumpy. The developers had a lot of ideas that did not make it into the final game. Nintendo screwed them a bit too, which led to it becoming a Sony exclusive title, and of course, some game elements and story ideas had to change over the development. That is natural in this process. In a project of this scope, doing things that had never been done before, this can easily lead to some inconsistencies, of which there are many in Final Fantasy VII, and by accident, some of those inconsistencies made sense and created mystery. Fans developed ideas and theories around, but they never were intended. Finding those awoke the desire of there being more to the story than there actually is. And weirdly, a theme of the game is the puppet master in the background and illusions and manipulations. This fueled the desire of the player to lift the veil and look behind it, but in the minds of the developers there is no veil. In reality, not every part of a game is planned through into the smallest details and connected to a genius master plan for the story of the game. This is not Tolkien, who spent literally a lifetime doing this with Lord of the Rings and his mythology surrounding it, and it took a lifetime of his son to complete and explain it all. No game development has so much time. I said at the beginning of the video that the developers were geniuses or fools. Turns out they were also fools. The great conspiracy of Final Fantasy VII's story, the hidden puppet master in the background, is just an accident of inconsistencies, a flawed translation, and not enough time to explain certain elements well enough. It's, as the game implies it, on a very basic level, just Sephiroth. This truth is actually a bit boring from my perspective, but we should never forget that in game development, happy little accidents are what make games great. Combos in Street Fighter 2 were a design accident, noticed in playtesting and left in the game, and it should change how fighting games are played forever. Same with strafe jumping or, I assume, rocket jumps in shooters. Final Fantasy VII is still a great game, and if you don't know, the Genova Theory still makes totally sense, especially in the Western versions, no matter what the developers said afterwards. In my mind, the Genova Theory stays canon and the most plausible theory. It's the only conclusion I personally can come to, even though I also see the appeal of a hybrid theory. For me, this game spawned a passion of looking deep into details like these, in which I often get lost, and that can't be taken away from me or you. So thank you for developing Final Fantasy VII, a milestone in video game history. Thank you for watching. I often said I will make a lore video that is not Tolkien related at some point. Well, here it is. I did not expect it to be over an hour long, but I hope you enjoyed it. It was a ton of work to make. Thank you again to Hawkeye777 who translated some passages from the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VII for me. Links to his Twitch channel and Twitter are in the description. If you liked this video, feel free pressing the like button. Leave a comment and share your thoughts and theories. Check my channel and maybe recommend me further. If you are still watching after over an hour and you think about subscribing, consider pressing the annoying bell too if you want notifications when I upload something new. In these difficult times, stay safe and healthy. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.